Welcome to This Explainer, everyone. Today, we're unpacking a genuinely fascinating intersection of human history, and that is the relationship between gender variance and institutional power. Throughout this explainer, we're going to look at exactly how different societies across time have recognized, integrated, and, well, actually empowered individuals who exist outside a strict gender binary. We're going to trace how the architecture of agency has evolved, literally from sacred ancient traditions to imperial courts all the way to modern corporate boardrooms. Okay, let's dive into this. Because, if you just look at mainstream media today, you'd probably think these discussions only started in the 21st century. But history tells a very different story. Power, influence, and agency outside the binary, they actually have incredibly deep, complex roots. So here is our historical roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with roles beyond the binary, then move into spiritual and cultural power, and follow that up with the imperial bureaucracy. After that, we'll explore global traditions of agency, dive into the modern Hollywood paradox, and finally wrap up by comparing natures of power. Right, Section 1, Roles Beyond the Binary. Let's establish our historical baseline. When we look across history and across cultures, a really distinct pattern emerges. Societies haven't just, casually recognized gender roles outside a strict binary, they have actively integrated them. Now, the nature of these roles obviously varied wildly, ranging from spiritual stewardship to high-level political administrative power. But the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that these individuals shared a common trait. They were socially integrated and very often exceptionally influential. They weren't outsiders looking in. They were essential pillars of their community's structures. Moving on to Section 2, Spiritual and Cultural Power. Here is where we see a profound, almost grand level of cultural reverence. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this fantastic example from the Zuni culture of Native America. They recognized the Lhamana. These were typically male-bodied individuals who were understood to embody both male and female spirits. And because of this dual spirit, they took on social and ceremonial roles traditionally associated with women. But here's the kicker. The Lhamana were absolutely not marginalized. No way. They were held in incredibly high regard as spiritual leaders, artisans, and vital cultural ambassadors for the Zuni people. To really anchor this concept, let's look at the story of Wiwa. Living from 1849 to 1896, Wiwa is perhaps the most famous Lhamana in history. They were a brilliant master weaver and potter, highly respected for their extensive knowledge of Zuni lore. They were even a key member of both the Men's Kachina Society and the Medicine Society. Wiwa wielded tremendous, socially sanctioned institutional power, acting as a diplomatic representative who famously traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. to meet with U.S. government officials. Just a brilliant detail illustrating how this power was fully sanctioned and integrated into society. Let's shift gears a bit. Section 3, the Imperial Bureaucracy. This represents a very different, highly calculated path to power. So we just saw the spiritual stewardship of the Zuni Lhamana, which was completely rooted in cultural reverence, right? Well, in Imperial China, court eunuchs occupied a position that contrasts sharply with that. Their power was heavily bureaucratic and political, based entirely on a calculated proximity to the absolute monarchy. Why? Well, in the context of the traditional patriarchal family line, eunuchs were considered incomplete. They couldn't father heirs to compete with the emperor. And because of this specific physical and social status, they were quite literally the only men trusted and allowed inside the inner chambers of the palace. The sheer scale of systemic power this gave them is just staggering. To put that into perspective, at the height of their influence, especially during the Ming Dynasty, eunuchs weren't just servants. They managed vast imperial bureaucracies. They commanded massive military forces. They led unprecedented global maritime expeditions, like the famous explorer Zheng He. Because they were the emperor's most trusted confidants, they acted as his filter, effectively controlling access to the throne itself. This allowed them to dictate national policy and even leverage military command to influence the selection of future emperors. That is serious power. All right, Section 4, Global Traditions of Agency. Let's speed things up a bit because this is not an isolated phenomenon. You might think the examples we just covered were rare exceptions, but they really aren't. Let's take a rapid-fire global tour here. In South Asia, we see the Hijras, a recognized third gender with a massive history of cultural and religious significance. Moving over to ancient Rome and Syria, the Galli were eunuch priests of the goddesses Sibylla and other goddess. Out in Hawaii, the Mahu are traditionally revered individuals embodying both male and female traits, serving as vital healers. And in the Balkans, we see the sworn virgins, individuals assigned female at birth who adopt a male social role to step into family leadership. The pattern here is vast, global, and undeniably historical. This brings us to Section 5, the modern Hollywood paradox. And here the tone shifts, because power today often has to be actively fought for against systemic barriers. And this brilliantly illustrates the stark difference between merely being a costume on screen versus actually holding the power to tell the story. For much of its history, modern Hollywood treated trans and non-binary identities merely as objects of representation, frequently relying on victim or villain tropes. And honestly, it gets worse, because these roles were historically performed by cisgender actors in what's called transface. It reinforced this damaging idea that these identities were just costumes, so while they were visible on screen, they had absolutely zero institutional power, none of that actual green light authority that's held by studio executives and financiers. However, as our source material notes, we're seeing an ongoing shift toward agency. Power is increasingly moving from mere on-screen representation to actual executive and creative control. A growing number of trans and non-binary writers and directors are finally gaining ground to dictate their own narratives. But there is a very real paradox here. Because while visibility is at an all-time high, the underlying corporate power structures of the studio system have remained pretty resistant to systemic change. This friction basically leaves many trans creators working within the margins, fighting for agency rather than acting as the primary wielders of corporate power. Finally, Section 6, comparing natures of power. Let's bring all of this together to synthesize what we've learned across these totally different eras. Let's move to and see how this builds into a clear evolution when we compare these eras side by side. We started with the Zuni Lhamana, where the nature of power was cultural and spiritual, deeply rooted in community tradition, where power was essentially granted by society. Then we looked at the Chinese eunuchs, where power was bureaucratic and purely dependent on proximity to a monarch. And finally, modern Hollywood, where power is creative and narrative. It's focused on storytelling, but as we saw, it's a power that must be actively navigated and earned against modern structural barriers. Now, before we wrap up, here is a crucial point of clarification. While modern terms like transgender or non-binary are super useful frameworks for us today, we have to remember the context. Many of these historical cultures operated on distinctly different understandings. They didn't view these individuals as trans in the modern Western sense. Instead, they were understood to be occupying a distinct, socially sanctioned, and very often essential third category within their own unique cultural frameworks. Which brings us to the final thought I want to leave you with today. We've seen models where power was naturally granted by ancient tradition, and we've explored models where power has to be aggressively earned and navigated through modern structures. So what does this all mean? How do you feel these different models of granted versus earned power inform our current understanding of gender in today's professional environments? Does our modern corporate structure actually have way more to learn from history than we might think? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will catch you next time.